Thumbs up. We're recording. Thank you for not recording the false start before. I appreciate that as well. So I do appreciate the opportunity to be part of the speaker series. I may, having looked through some of the prior talks, be a bit unique among the speakers that you have had. I am not a scientist. I am not an engineer. I am not an academic. I am a political philosophy major. I am a recovering attorney, and I am an entrepreneur now. And while I'm going to talk about methane today, I'm going to really be approaching it as part of a business case. And I'm going to share with you how the company that I co-founded, Tradewater, uses carbon offset credits as a tool to fight climate change by preventing the release of halocarbons and methane at scale. I hope you find it interesting and perhaps get inspired to help us achieve some of our goals. And I have some to-dos at the end for those who are interested. Everyone knows about carbon dioxide, of course. This is the emissions from burning fossil fuels, chopping down trees. But not everybody knows about non-CO2 gases. These are things like methane, refrigerants, halons, and black carbon. But people really do need to be focused on non-CO2 gases. The IPCC says that there is no pathway for us to prevent 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming without addressing non-CO2 gases. These gases are fewer by volume, but they are more significant in certain important ways. They are more potent than CO2, hundreds and even thousands of times more potent. They are often short-lived climate pollutants, which means they do their damage faster than carbon dioxide and need to be handled now in order to give us time to reduce emissions and transition to a greener economy. And really importantly, they cannot be sequestered once released. No fancy carbon capture technology, no amount of planting trees is going to allow you to pull refrigerants or methane out of the atmosphere. Historically speaking, non-CO2 gases account for nearly half of all global warming from human activity since 1970. And there's an even broader breakdown of this in the pie chart on the side. Fighting climate change requires attention being paid to non-CO2 gases. So Tradewater, we are a mission-based, for-profit B corporation. We are headquartered in Chicago. We are operating around the world. We've grown from 6 people to nearly 60 in 8 years. And our mission is to improve the environment and create economic opportunity by collecting, controlling, and destroying potent, high-impact non-CO2 greenhouse gases. In doing this, we've set a particular goal to prove that a company that is committed to protecting the planet can be just as profitable as a company that operates by destroying the planet. To date, we have already prevented 7.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent from being released into the environment. Actually heard today it's 7.8 million metric tons. And we are in the middle of a 5-year plan that would see us get to 27 million tons of CO2e prevention by the end of 2027. So when Tradewater talks about non-CO2 gases, there are 2 particular categories that we target. First, ozone-depleting halocarbons. This includes things like CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and HCFCs, hydrochlorofluorocarbons. More colloquially, we're talking about refrigerants. These are gases that are in air conditioning systems and refrigerators and chillers all over the world. We're also talking about halons, which are gas fire suppressants used in airplanes and data centers, places where if there's a fire, you do not want to be dumping water onto everything, and instead use gas to put them out. These gases are banned from production under the Montreal Protocol because they deplete the ozone layer. Because of the Montreal Protocol and this ban, we have stopped making them. We recognize that by stopping the production of them and transitioning to newer kinds of refrigerants and cooling gases, we will allow the ozone layer time to heal. And we have actually done that. The ozone layer is being repaired, and it is widely considered one of the most successful environmental treaties of all time. But the Montreal Protocol contains a hole of its own, and that is because there is no provision for the end of life. All of the modeling assumes that everything produced before the ban will be released. And while that is okay for the ozone layer, it is a problem for climate change because these are potent greenhouse gases. CFC12, a chlorofluorocarbon, often called freon, is more than 10,200 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So we work to prevent the status quo end of life, which is release, by finding, collecting these halocarbons all over the world, transporting them to regulated destruction facilities for safe and effective destruction, and permanently preventing them from being released into the atmosphere. This is a huge task when you consider that there are over 11 billion tons of CO2e worth of just CFC refrigerant gases alone. The second non-CO2 gas that we go after is methane. I don't need to tell this group about the scope and scale of the problem. Like refrigerants, it is multiple times more potent than CO2. It is prevalent all over the world and comes from a variety of sources. We work within this space to target a particular source of leaks, and these are oil and gas wells that have been orphaned and no longer have anybody responsible to plug them. We work with states to identify orphan oil and gas wells. We get permission from the state to plug them. We work with landowners, and we pay to have them plugged, permanently preventing them from leaking methane into the future. You'll note here on the slide that US EPA estimates there are nearly 3.2 million abandoned wells, and we can talk about abandoned versus orphaned, in the United States alone. This is a huge undertaking to be involved with and a key step in the fight against climate change. So you might ask, where's the profit? How does Tradewater make money? This all sounds great and important, but you're finding gases, you're paying to move them, you're paying to destroy them, you're paying to have them credited, you have staff, you got a team, same with the methane. How do you make money? And the answer is carbon offset credits. The work that we do happens in regulatory gaps. There's no mandate to destroy halocarbons. There's nobody responsible for plugging orphaned wells. But the environmental benefit achieved from the work is easily understood and can be quantified. And so we do it. We identify these gases. We permanently prevent them from being released. We generate quantifiable carbon climate benefits in the form of carbon offset credits. And then we take that money and we reinvest it in the hunt for more gases to collect and destroy. In short, we are leveraging private financing to fight climate change and make an impact in the world. Now, carbon offset credit fundamentals. A little bit of a 101 here. Not sure how much familiarity all of you have, but this can help set the stage for our conversation here. Carbon offset credit is really a certificate. It's a token that documents the mitigation of greenhouse gases equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So 1 carbon offset credit equals 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. And that's the currency that everybody trades in. There's 2 basic types of carbon offset credit projects. One is avoided emissions. This is things like preventing the release of refrigerant or methane. The second is sequestered carbon dioxide. Trees that are planted, for example, to absorb CO2 that's already been released and pull it out of the atmosphere. In order to undertake these 2 basic types of projects, these 2 mitigation activities, you have to work according to published protocols or methodologies. These are strict rules that dictate exactly what you must do to be able to make an environmental claim that withstands scrutiny. All of these activities, according to these rules, are then verified or audited by an accredited third party to confirm that you've complied with the rules and the accuracy of their claims, of your claims for environmental benefit. And these carbon credits are then issued by the publisher of those rules, the protocol or the methodology. And so some of the entities that create these rules and issue these credits can be governments like the California Air Resources Board, which has really sparked the offset movement. The Department of Ecology in the state of Washington is another government that has a carbon offset program and methodologies that we use. There's registries, which are NGOs like the American Carbon Registry, Vera, Climate Action Reserve, and Gold Standard. And then there are some challenger registries that are using blockchain technology to develop protocols and issue credits that can be tracked in a market to make sure they're not double counted. These are platforms like 06, One Shot, and Carbon Path. And each credit they're issued after verification is given a unique identification number. And this allows them to be sold to somebody who can own it and own it uniquely, and then use it either to trade and make more money or to offset their own emissions by effectively tearing up that certificate and throwing it in the garbage and saying, thank you for doing that work. By you destroying that refrigerant, I am able to reduce my overall footprint from driving my cars, operating my machinery. Now, if you know anything about carbon offset credits, you know they're not without controversy, especially lately. And the two biggest criticisms that we hear are, one, they don't help the climate. They just provide people a pass, allowing them to pay money to feel good about themselves while continuing to pollute. The second criticism we hear is that they cannot be trusted, either because of fraud or because of inaccuracies or overstatement of the environmental benefit. We've all seen the Guardian articles and the headlines or the John Oliver skits poking fun at carbon offset credits. So I just want to respond to these and share our perspective on this and why it's important. First, in terms of not helping the climate, studies show that companies who offset are more likely to also reduce emissions. We all know that, yes, you cannot just create more and more and more emissions and offset and feel good about it. You must reduce your emissions and offset what you can't reduce. That combination is what we need to achieve 1.5 degrees. But studies show that companies who are doing offsetting work harder to reduce because they have now put an internal price on the cost of emissions. And once you do that and factor it into your business model, no one wants to buy carbon offset credits because they're expensive. As a result, if you start to buy these offsets and build that into your business model, you are going to emit less. The other thing I'll say about not helping the climate is that nobody would destroy refrigerants. Very few people would plug orphaned oil and gas wells outside of charity without carbon offset credits. There are simply some environmental problems that don't have a different solution beyond private money being leveraged to finance this work and offset emissions elsewhere. In terms of not being able to trust them, this, ironically, all the criticism has sparked a lot of work from entities like the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, who have established things like core carbon principles. And they're really helping regulate the market of what a quality carbon offset should be. Like anything in life, there is fraud, for sure, but it is the exception. Nobody here stops trading stocks just because some people get themselves involved in Ponzi schemes. And in terms of the quality of a credit, the reality is that not all offsets are created equal. Buyers need to be smart and look to things like the ICVCM that set standards for governance. Are these registries that issue these methodologies legitimate? Are they smart? Are they peer reviewed? Are the emissions impact that's being claimed real and good? Is it additional? Is it something that wouldn't have happened but for the opportunity to sell carbon credits? Is it permanent? Will it permanently avoid this emission or sequester this carbon? Or is there a risk that it could be reversed through fire or disease later? Is it accurate? Have you conservatively calculated the environmental benefit with sound scientific principles? And have you done it in a way that is responsible? Are you doing these projects in a manner that doesn't create an additional harm or a different harm somewhere in the world? And in fact, hopefully creates a benefit by doing the work that you're doing. The key takeaway on this criticism, I would say, is that the perception of offset credits impacts what we can do, what people are willing to pay, whether there's enough money available to allow us to do the work that we do. So as a carbon offset developer, we take these criticisms seriously. We think about what people are saying, and we look to standards like the ICVCM and make sure that the work that we do and the credits that we generate meet these high standards. So let's talk a little bit about Tradewater's projects. I'm going to start with halocarbons, and then I'm going to get to methane. What does this work look like? Where do you find these refrigerants? I'm going to start in the US. We have a team of people whose job it is literally to scour the US and scour the world to find these old refrigerants. Remember, under the Montreal Protocol, these have been banned from productions, these old CFCs. They have not been made since 2010 globally and early 1990s in the US. We find them in the US still, however, 30 years later, hiding in basements, in garages, in service shops, in auto shops. And they come in 30-pound cylinders that you can see sort of in these boxes. This is literally the back of a car from one of our guys based out in California who finds these refrigerants, drives around, buys them from people, collects them, and transports them to our warehouse just outside of Chicago. This is what this work looks like in Southern Africa. These are abandoned tonners full of CFC-12. They were left outside to rust because the user of them no longer had equipment that took CFC-12. And he had no way to get rid of this, no need to get rid of it. And so these cylinders are found literally outside of his shop. This is what it looks like in the Middle East, where we are working with a reclaimer who is out there responsibly recovering this gas from chillers and from large institutions and buildings and putting them into these tonner containers and looking to the market then to finance their work and saying to a company like Tradewater, what will you pay me? Because someone else might pay me to be able to reuse this and put it back into old equipment. So we work with them to buy that gas, to ship it off to be destroyed, and to make sure it never reaches the atmosphere. And this is what it looks like in Thailand, where the customs department 15 to 25 years ago was responsible for seizing material manufactured in China and being illegally moved across the border during the production phase when it was still permissible to produce it, but when it couldn't be traveling to certain parts of the world. And this stockpile was sitting all over Thailand in different customs depots where it was intercepted. We worked with the customs department. We brought them all together. We found a destruction facility capable of destroying them. And we have been working over the past year and a half to ensure that all of these 130,000, I believe, cylinders are destroyed. So what does it mean then, once you find it, you move it, you have it destroyed, how does it become a carbon offset credit? And how do you ensure that you do this work in a way that can be verified and make people feel good about it? So first you do the project, you find it, you acquire it, you aggregate it, you ship it to a destruction facility, you weigh it, you conduct a lab analysis to confirm what it is, and you make sure it's safely and effectively destroyed. Then you have the project verified. This involves hiring a third-party auditing firm called a verifier, and you have them audit the work. Did you follow the rules? Did you accurately quantify the environmental benefit achieved? This is a strange process, of course, because if you did the work well, there is nothing to see. It is gone. All of those cylinders and containers I showed you are empty, and there's nothing left. The same is true with our methane projects, by the way. If you do your work properly, there's just a bunch of grass left in the middle of a field in the spot where a well once lived. So the verification process involves documentation, paperwork, videos, photos that proves you did the work according to the rules. These papers include the protocol, a listing form, a filling form that shows how you got all these little cylinders put into big containers and prepared for destruction. It shows an analysis of that refrigerant sent to a certified lab that can tell you exactly what is the composition of the gas in the larger tank that you've filled it into. It includes a destruction certificate where you have weighed that container of gas on a calibrated scale, and you've done so within 48 hours of starting the destruction, and you've done it twice, at least a few minutes apart, to show that that weight is as accurate as it possibly can. It involves a certificate of destruction at the end that shows the post weight when you bring that tank back and put it on that same scale and you weigh it to show what it is empty, creating that net weight. It also involves things like continuous emissions monitoring data. During the process, we have to measure not only what we put into the incinerator or plasma arc unit, but what comes out of the stack, showing that 99.99% of the refrigerant that goes in is destroyed and only that small fraction comes out. Then we do a complicated calculation. Not super complicated actually, but a calculation where we take all of this data and we roll it all up and we assert that this is the environmental benefit that we've created. And that assertion is essentially the volume of gas, the purity of that gas, times the global warming potential of that gas, minus your project emissions. This includes the emissions from driving that refrigerant around to get it ready for destruction and running the equipment that's used to destroy it. So volume times purity times GWP minus project emissions gives you your credits. Verifier reviews all of this. They visit the destruction facility, they interview people, and they write a final report saying, yes, you are entitled to the environmental benefits you've claimed. They give that report to the registry that issued the rules, and they review it, ask some more questions, and then issue your carbon offset credits, which you can then sell into the market. The projects we've done to date include over 5.5 million tons in the US. We've done a project in Honduras, in Ghana, in the Dominican Republic, in Thailand, and in Chile, and we continue to do work in many other places. Can spend a lot of time on questions if you want at the end with respect to this, but this is the way in which this work meets those standards I show you for a high quality carbon offset project. This work is additional. These are ignored greenhouse gases. The Montreal Protocol, as we said, says you can't make them anymore, but assumes their release. The Paris Agreement, by the way, which talks about how we get to 1.5 degrees, doesn't include these ozone depleting gases because they say the Montreal Protocol has already taken care of it. So don't worry about them. They're going to be gone soon. GHG protocol, which people use to quantify their own corporate carbon emissions, doesn't include these gases as well because they assume they're being done by the Montreal Protocol. These gases are destroying them is also additional because it's difficult and expensive to find them and destroy them. The work is permanent. The refrigerants are literally incinerated, 99.99% destroyed, tracked all the way through. There's no risk that they're going to come back. The measurement is accurate. The gases are physically contained and measured before and after destruction, as I described. And the work is responsible. We put money back into the communities and we work by buying these gases and hiring people to collect them. And it works to prevent climate action and support industrial projects. Some challenges in doing the work that we do. One, finding them. There is no map. There's limited historical production data. And we actually find it fascinating that when we started this work, the US EPA had hired ICF, a well-known consulting firm, to do a vintaging model to say how much of these old CFC gases are left in the US and when will they all be gone? And their answer was 2015. We are still collecting thousands of pounds a week in the back of minivans, as I showed you in that picture. And that's just the CFCs. That doesn't include the halons and the HCFCs. We have limits on destruction facilities. There's limited technology that can safely destroy these refrigerant gases. They don't exist all over the world. And it is a problem that if we actually could get our hands on all of these gases, we wouldn't have the ability to destroy them. The Basel Convention is a barrier. This is an international treaty that governs the movement of hazardous waste. And these gases, when you designate them for destruction, are considered hazardous waste. So that means if you need to move them to one of these limited destruction facilities, say in France, from Chile, where you found them, you have to go through about 11 countries. And under the Basel Convention, you have to get permission from all 11 of those countries before you're allowed to put it on a boat and move it through. This is a huge cost and a huge barrier to do this work. And the last thing I'd say is a barrier is the reclamation myth. In general, reclamation is recycling of these gases. You can clean them up. And a lot of people think, hey, recycling is great. We should do that. And then we can put these recycled gases back into equipment and keep them going longer. We think that's a bad idea. Putting them back into this old equipment means they're going to leak. It is so hard to get your hands on this material. Once you do get your hands on it, we think the only responsible thing to do is to go out and destroy it and force people to change out their old equipment and put in new equipment that uses low GWP refrigerants instead. Methane projects, plugging orphaned oil and gas wells. We also have a team that goes out and scours the forests and the fields for orphaned oil and gas wells. Now, this is not exactly a wild goose chase like the refrigerants. There are maps. Each state has a list of documented orphaned oil and gas wells and some location information for you. But finding them on property, finding them literally in the middle of crops and other trees, getting access to that land is a challenge. And our team works very, very hard to go out and find them so that we can validate them. And this is what you see. You have wells that were drilled, production piping that's often in place, and then for some reason, they are orphaned. They are left behind. And instead of doing the responsible thing that you're required to do, of plugging and remediating the land and returning it to its natural state, people orphan them. The reasons can include bankruptcy of the company, death of the producer or driller, or simple irresponsibility and running away in any legal way possible. This is another example in crops where you find literally someone running their farm all around this, and somebody has left this pile in the middle with wild greens growing up around it, a complete eyesore as well as an incredible danger for people. There's over 106,000 documented orphan wells in the state databases, but this is a gross underestimate of what is actually out there. Between 2015 and 2022, more than 600 oil and gas companies filed for bankruptcy, meaning it's just a matter of time before many of the wells that they had in their portfolio get designated as orphaned. The list of 20,000 orphan wells in Pennsylvania alone grows by about 400 per year. The number is going to get bigger and bigger. And as I said earlier on, there's 3.2 million abandoned wells. So the abandoned wells mean that someone maybe still exists. They haven't died, they haven't gone completely bankrupt, but they have walked away and nobody knows how to get in touch with them. And it's only a matter of time before those abandoned wells become orphaned wells. We have had some success. This is a new project type to us, and we are moving in this field. We have been working mostly in Indiana, which is not too far from where our headquarters is here in Chicago. To date, we have plugged 10 wells. We are in the process of plugging 2 more, which will happen at the end of this month. And the environmental impact is over 1.5 million tons of CO2e that we have prevented from doing this work so far. Just as importantly, we have been working in the market to explain to people the high quality of these methane offset credits. And we're going to talk about this a little bit because this is an area where I think there's some opportunity for help. The work is additional. That is not disputed. When you have an orphaned oil and gas well, nobody is responsible for plugging it. Technically, it falls back to the state, but they don't have the money to do this, nor the resources, time, people to make it happen. Many of you have probably heard that there was federal funding in the recent infrastructure bill that put, I think it's $4.7 million out there to be used to plug orphan and abandoned oil and gas wells. And that's awesome. Some people said, hey, does that mean there's no need for carbon developers to do it? The answer is no. This chart on the side shows in blue the amount of money the percentage of sorry, let me start over here. About $61 million is what's estimated to plug all orphaned wells. This is not just the documented one. These are the undocumented ones. The blue is the money that's been made available by the federal government. The orange represents the gap to plug all documented orphaned wells. So even if we only looked at the 106,000 documented orphaned wells, we still have that gap of orange, which is about $4.2 million. If we think about the undocumented wells that will soon be orphaned, that number goes up to over $60 billion estimated. So will the federal funding provide enough to do this? The answer is no. We need to be able to leverage private finance or do other sourcing of money to make this happen. In terms of permanence, properly plugged wells will not leak. There is a permanence to this that people can feel really, really good about. Responsible, absolutely. Something fresh and in the news, people are excited about this, but what we tell them is that not only are we plugging these wells, but we're restoring the contaminated land. We are preventing the release of things, not just like methane, but hydrogen sulfide, which we find in a lot of the wells in Indiana. It's estimated that 9 million Americans live within 1 mile of an orphaned well, and the contamination, the odor, the danger, as well as the explosiveness, as well as the disruption to economy from being right in the middle of cropland makes it a responsible project to do. The only little question about this project type has to do with accuracy. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. In terms of methane challenges, just to hit on them, in addition to an absence of enough money to do it, for us as project developers, all of this is done at the state level. So each state has different databases, different levels of information, different receptivity to working with us. Some of them welcome us in. Others say, hey, don't do this. We got this under control. There's rules regarding the ability to measure wells. Before we can plug a well, we need to measure it. We need to assure that it's leaking. We need to understand what is leaking out of it. Some states invite us to do that. Others say, if you touch that well, you own it. And that, of course, creates a big business risk for us in going out into the field. While wells are orphaned and have no responsible owner, they all exist on land that is owned by someone. So one of the barriers is working with landowners. We need to get their permission to come onto their land to deal with the well. It's hard because it's not always easy to identify the landowners, let alone get in contact with them. If you do talk to them, you have to explain what's going on. And then when you get out there, they get excited that you're going to finally solve this eyesore for them. And some of them end up, of course, being disappointed if it doesn't work from a project standpoint. Plugging must be done right. The good news is this can happen, right? There are known ways to plug a well that's secure and permanent. Cast iron bridge plugs, concrete poured in, remediation around the wellhead. So there are people capable of doing this, known technologies, but there's not a ton of them. And so making sure that you have access, like with the destruction facility, access to plugging rigs and smart and responsible plugging contractors is a challenge, and it can be expensive to go and do. And of course, it's regional. So if you have someone who can help you in Indiana and Illinois, they may not be able to help you in New Mexico or down in Louisiana. And then this gets us back to that accuracy, this conservative measurement. Quantifying the environmental benefit must be done well. We talked earlier, if you want a good carbon offset credit, you got to believe that if I'm buying 1 million tons of carbon credits from this project, I can be assured that at least 1 million tons of environmental impact was achieved. This is one of the criticisms that come up in Guardian and articles, right? That say, hey, they say they bought 1 million tons, but in fact, half of those trees that were supposed to be sequestering carbon actually burned down or caught disease. And in fact, that the CO2 wasn't absorbed at the scale that people thought it would. This causes people to be skittish in the market, to not want to buy carbon offset credit. And we do not want that to be the case for these methane credits. We want to think about how do we measure this in a really conservative and thoughtful way. But as you can imagine, it's hard. It's not like taking a tank of refrigerant that exists in a cylinder that can be put on a scale and sent to a lab for analysis where it's contained. This methane from these wells is underground. These wells are living and breathing things. They're often dangerous to work with under pressure, contaminated with hydrogen sulfide. We lack a lot of data for many of these orphaned wells. There isn't good production data because they became orphaned. People weren't excited about working with them. There's different GWP factors you guys can use, whether you're talking about 20 years versus 100 years. And ultimately, we're predicting the future. What is the potential to emit over time? If we don't plug this leaking well, how long do we think about it leaking? Will it be 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 200 years? This is a challenge for us in the carbon offset space and something that we want to get right. So the challenge of doing this well is reflected by comparing 3 different carbon offset protocols, one by ACR, one by Carbon Path, and one by B-carbon. And you'll see that they talk about different ways of being in the field. Do you use a chamber method or a direct hookup? Do you only detect passive leaks? Do you multiply and give a credit period of 20 years or 50 years? Do you use the 100-year GWP of 28 or the 20-year GWP of 84? Should you be taking 2 measurements? Should you be taking 1 measurement? How much post-plugging monitoring should you be doing to make sure that you plug the well right? As you can see, again, 3 different protocols have put out rules. They all do it 3 different ways. Because we work with the American Carbon Registry and have done our initial projects that way, I'm going to just dig in quickly to what they ask. This is to spark some brilliant minds that I know are listening in here. They say 2 measurements, 30 days apart. Measurement 1, wait 30 days, measurement 2. Once you do those measurements, you can plug it, and then you do 1 post-plugging measurement. When you do your measurements, you're looking at flow of gas, concentration of methane, and pressure. You must take your measurements in intervals of at least every 10 minutes. And those measurements must last at a minimum of 2 hours. Not only do you do that, but you then have to look at whether your measurements constitute stability. And according to the American Carbon Registry, this means that you combine your flow and concentration data points and you draw a line of best fit through those different data points and look at the line that occurs at the beginning of your period and at the end of your 2 hours. And if it varies by more than 1% up or down, it's not considered stable. The same with your pressure reading. But if you do find that they're stable across those 2 measurement periods, 2 hours, 30 days apart, you then also need to check whether the concentration of methane flowing out in measurement 1 and 2 is within 10% of the first and the second. So both stable and both essentially the same. If you meet both of those, then you multiply the methane flow per day times the global warming potential, in their case 28, times 20 years, which is what they have deemed to be a reasonable proxy for the potential to emit of this well, minus your project emissions, again, what it costs to plug the well and move all your equipment around. And that is the credits that you are given as a result. And again, you go through that whole verification process, providing the paperwork along the way. I will just tell you that this is challenging for us. These stability parameters are incredibly tight. It requires a well that's either leaking a very small amount, which means not a lot of carbon credits, which means very, very hard to incur all the costs of plugging, because plugging a well basically costs the same regardless of how much is leaking out. Or it requires you to blow down wells that have a lot of pressure and a lot of methane coming out of them. And that can take a lot of time and create a lot of dangers. These wells, of course, are not predictable. So even if you can get one stable measurement, it's no guarantee you'll get a second stable measurement or that those two measurements will be similar within 10% of each other. And again, blowing down these wells, working with them, and getting them in a position where you can take a stable measurement can take days. 24/7 monitoring, flaring the gas that's coming off of them. They're often near people's and homes. They include hydrogen sulfide and other contaminants. And then, of course, once you get through all of this, you have challenges in the market where people say things like, is 2 hours long enough? Are 2 measurements enough? Why 20 years? What if you cannot achieve this narrow band of stability? All of these are challenges we're facing in some of the wells that we are working with. We are struggling to meet this very, very narrow definition. And it's causing us to ask the question, are there different, better, more conservative, more rigorous ways of quantifying the emissions that are leaking? How you can help, and then I'm happy to take questions. One, support the value of high quality carbon offset credits. Be part of the people who recognize that there are certain environmental problems that can only be solved in this way, and they're really, really important to do. And second, I would love it if this meta group and methane focused people have thoughts about how we can rigorously quantify the environmental benefit of plugging orphaned oil and gas wells. Whew, I made it. So I'm at the end. I would love to take questions or get any thoughts that you guys have. And I'm hoping, Colette, you can help me with that.